Welcome back, everyone. I had a small hiatus, but we are back to playing rated events, and I'm going to go over an event that I played a couple weeks ago at our weekly chess club against a player named Chris. Chris is 1585, and he's touted as a very aggressive player. So, came into this game. I knew that Chris was going to be a good player. He had beaten Wayne, who featured in my last video last week, and I knew I was going to be in for a fight. Now, I played my typical setup, going for a traditional King's Indian. Now, this setup is mostly predicated on freeing up the long diagonal and getting the knight out and castling quickly. And if he castles on the same side, we will launch an attack with our f-pawn. So we continue with our normal setup, and here, this is typical development. There's a bunch of different ways to develop, and actually, because of this, I get mixed up. Now, I mix up the theory in my head, and I act playing a move that's incorrect. I thought this move was going to be fine. In a lot of lines, what ends up happening is takes, and knight takes a free pawn. But in these lines, typically, this rook can offer enough pressure to open this diagonal, and I think that I am happier because of the open diagonal. But this specific line, the bishop and the knight team up on this pawn by the king, and this plan won't work. So I accidentally stumble into this line and make my mistake. And here, the best move is to trade queens, force my rook off its defensive square so that you take a pawn with a threat, forcing my rook to go back. And here I'm just a little uncomfortable down a pawn for no reason, but it's still a game. My opponent, however, decides to get greedy and take the pawn first. Now this allows me to get my queen off of this staring contest and pressure the knight. And here I was taken aback. My opponent decides to take this pawn near my king, sacrificing 2 pieces for my rook and my pawn. Now, those of you that are good at math, you'll see that each piece is worth 3, and the pawn and the rook are worth 1 and 5, so that should be a fair trade. Now, a lot of the times this fair trade isn't so fair because now I have the majority of minor pieces. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces that aren't pawns. You only have 1, 2, 3, 4. That means that if we're fighting over a pawn and you use all of your pieces to defend it and I use all of my pieces to attack it, I'll have more pieces and I can take it. So typically, the 2 pieces for the rook is not an even trade. It is slightly better for the person with the 2 pieces. But if the opponent can organize their pieces and launch an attack quickly, my king is exposed in the middle of the board. So we'll have to see how they proceed. They hop their knight in, threatening my queen and my knight, saying you can either move your queen and then you're going to have to get rid of your knight, or you're going to have to take me. Here, the first move I thought about was taking the free pawn, but this traps my rook in the corner. So I just went ahead and took his knight, said, I'll enjoy my godlike bishop. I'm going to get my other bishop out, and we're going to enjoy the open lines. Now, I expected pawn takes here to get off this line and open up his rook for lines on my queen and king. He's a little short-sighted. He makes this idea coming down with a check saying, well, if you block, then I'll take. Luckily, I am a little smarter than that, and I block with the queen, saying, if you trade, now I get developed, and your pieces are all in the back row. And then you have to jump back, defending your pawn still, and wasting your time moving your queen around. So my opponent doesn't like the idea of wasting time, so they let me develop and get my two snipers all the way looking open sight lines down onto the queen side. Opponent develops with tempo, threatening a pawn. And here, the most natural move is to start a pawn chain, but I notice the opponent only has a dark square bishop. That means they have no pieces that fight directly for the light squares. So controlling light squares is going to be easy for me, and I don't need to use pawns to do it. But controlling dark squares is going to be more difficult, and I'd like to restrict this bishop as much as I can. So I decide to play c5 with the idea of building up on the dark squares and making this bishop less powerful. My opponent here sees that I'm going to be building on the dark squares, and they decide, well, if they're building all their pawns on the dark squares, I might as well just get rid of this bishop. This isn't a particularly good move, as bishops are typically better than knights, especially in open positions where there's lots of sight lines and the pawns still have lots of movement. And it was an undeveloped piece trading for a developed piece, which means he spent 2 moves on a piece that I spent 0 moves. So not only is it a bad trade material, it's a bad trade on time. So all of my pieces are developed. My pawns are ready to cascade where I am stronger. Notice I am significantly stronger on the queen side, and I'm weaker on the king side with my open king. So my opponent should be trying to launch an attack on my king. However, in this position, after the dust settles, I am threatening to win material. So my opponent has to respond, and my attack begins. Now in this position, my opponent claims the open file. When I saw this move, I saw it and I wasn't scared. I thought that this move was kind of like a trophy wife. It looks great, but doesn't really do anything. You know, you're controlling squares, but all of the important ones are defended, and you're not really going to be able to infiltrate or get in. I continue with my attack. The main motif of the King's Indian is to open this diagonal, and threatening that with b5, b4 is common. So this idea that if he takes, I'm going to have an open diagonal, and if he doesn't take, I will take, and this pawn will be weak for the rest of time. So I know that I'm in a good position, especially after he takes my pawn, and the most natural move here is to simply recapture and say, I have a fork. I win a pawn and I win another pawn. How can that be a bad move? I thought if takes, then his rook gets time to activate with pressure. and if I waste time taking this pawn, then suddenly he has counterplay on an open file where he can actually do something. So I play a nice in-between move, taking this pawn with a threat on his rook, saying if you'd like to take my pawn, then I will simply take your rook and I'll be up a full piece. And he chooses not to lose his rook, the very human approach. And I defend my bishop, saying, even if you push me out, I can take and defend my rook. And if you try to push me out another way, I can always move back, defending my rook and attacking two pieces at the same time, forcing material to come off the board. Now, in the position where you have two pieces for the rook, it is always better, almost always better, to trade material, because if you trade absolutely everything, the endgame will just be two pieces for the rook. It's very easy to coordinate two pieces against a singular pawn, and it will only have one defender being the rook. But when there's lots of pieces on the board, it takes lots of time to coordinate. So trading these pieces off, I have the choice to either take with the bishop or the pawn. The pawn is a passed pawn, which means it has no resistance, but it is also a pawn island, meaning that it can be a weakness in the future, and I happen to have two pawn islands. So capturing with the pawn creates connected pawns, and I notice that my bishop always has eyes on this a2 pawn, which is the only thing keeping my b pawn from promoting. And even now I'm having ideas of sacrificing this bishop so that I can push my pawn through. Doesn't quite work yet. This is where I started my calculation. And I push through, but he takes with check, and then he wraps around. And there's no way for me to promote yet. So instead, I pushed my pawn up, and I said, okay, well, maybe I'll have a sacrifice in the future if I can get my king all the way over and protect this pawn. Little did I know that I was protecting this pawn through backwards X-ray vision. It's very, very difficult to see this from a distance, but I have takes, push, and you cannot take this pawn because of backwards defense. And even if you try to pin the pawn, I'll simply move. You can take my bishop because I'll get a queen. I miss this, however, and I decide to walk in my king as he does the same. My king comes up, and now he should be focusing his play where he's stronger. He has a pawn majority, that's 4 pawns against 2. So he should be pushing these pawns, trying to make my life more difficult. He's choosing not to, and so I'm going to restrict his movement. Now, even if he wants to, he will not be able to push these pawns. And if he'd like to lash out against me, I will just protect and always keep this bind. He's honestly suffocating here. The king has no mobility. The rook can't escape. And this move comes back to threaten the skewer. Now, notice if I only went 1 square back, in the time that I move, he can move and protect the skewer. So we have to go all the way, use the distance. And he's floundering. He doesn't quite know what to do here. He's just moving his rook back and forth. Meanwhile, my bishops are swarming. My bishops are swarming. Hello. And the king is running out of moves. Now, my opponent knows that if he goes back to the middle, I will check him again, or I will simply push my pawns, play around, and move in to take him. So he doesn't want any sort of draw or repetition, so he moves back, and moving back is a fatal flaw. It gives me a very easy way out, and I will go and maneuver my king, planning to just move in, infiltrate, and now here his rook is actually trapped. There is no way out for the rook. The two bishops dominate and show off exactly why two pieces are better than the rook. He sacrifices and tries to sneak a passed pawn by me. The bishop plays backwards defense. Actually, it's probably better to move the bishop over here to keep eyes on this square, but at this point, everything is winning. I have an extra piece. I can push the king back and take the pawn. And here is his last resort. He says, finally going to push my pawn majority, try and sneak through a passed pawn. I get to ignore him taking. He can take my pawn for free, but it doesn't matter because I will take his pawn, and these two pawns can never team up to get past my h-pawn, and in this position, he resigned. I was particularly proud of this game. It played at 96% accuracy, made one mistake at the very beginning, and besides that, almost perfect. I did miss the chance to sacrifice and win the game earlier, but moving my king is still winning. It just takes longer. And the truth is he has no moves. It's as long as I can create progress, then I will always win this game because I am the one that can move and he has no progress making moves. So very, very easy game for me. Not because my opponent didn't put up a fight, but because the control was always in my hands. I kept the initiative from probably the 10th move. Ever since we traded queens to the 12th move, I was able to keep an initiative, always threatening, and there was no real sweat. I knew that two bishops on an open board is always going to be better for me, and my opponent is just suffocating. No moves to be made until finally the game is over. You don't quite understand why the game ends here. His king has no moves. King can't move forward, and it can only move to the side, and if it ever moves to the side, it will be checked and forced to watch the c1 square for promotion. And while the king is sat there, my king will take all of his pawns, and I will promote a queen. Game is completely over. Well, that was a good one. I will update you tomorrow on the next games I play, but the rating is slowly going up and up, and I plan to play another decently sized tournament on March 15th, and we'll come back with results from that. Hopefully it goes as well as my last tournament, but I'm here to report win, lose, or draw, and grow from it and get better.